A dog asks the police for help, guides them, and they are terrified by what they see at the scene. It was a quiet day at the precinct with just a few officers and the occasional radio crackle. Finn, a seasoned detective, sipped his coffee, staring out the window, while his partner, Reese, reviewed case files at her desk. Suddenly, a familiar bark echoed outside the station. Finn glanced out, his eyes immediately landing on a scruffy dog sitting on the sidewalk. It was a dog they'd seen countless times before, often lounging by the station, but today something was different. The dog's bark grew more insistent, sharp, and urgent. It darted back and forth, as if trying to get their attention. Finn furrowed his brow. The dog's behavior seemed almost deliberate, as if it was trying to convey something.
Reese,
He called, pointing toward the window.
do you see that?
Reese looked up briefly.
Oh, the usual stray. Just wants some attention.
No, there's something strange about it today. It's acting like it's in distress.
Finn's voice was more serious now. Reese shook her head, a skeptical smile tugging at her lips.
It's just a dog, Finn. They do this. You're reading too much into it.
But Finn couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He grabbed his jacket.
I'm going to check it out.
Reese sighed but followed him.
You're really going to follow a dog now?
Finn simply nodded.
Just trust me on this.
The two officers stepped outside and approached the dog. As they neared, the dog immediately bolted down the street, glancing back to ensure they were following. Its barks grew louder, almost frantic. Finn exchanged a look with Reese.
Looks like it's leading us somewhere.
Finn said, his voice filled with curiosity.
Or just trying to get away from you?
Reese replied dryly, but her tone had lost some of its initial skepticism. Without waiting for her reply, Finn followed the dog as it darted between parked cars and across deserted streets. The city's quiet streets felt strange, almost too quiet, and the air grew heavy, as though something was lurking just beyond their perception. The dog led them deeper into the city, through narrow alleys that Finn and Reese rarely traveled. The buildings here were older, their brickwork faded and chipped. Abandoned storefronts and broken windows seemed to stare back at them, adding to the eerie atmosphere. Reese's unease grew.
Okay, Finn, this is getting weird. Why are we following a stray dog into these parts of town? There's nothing here but old buildings and who knows what else.
But Finn wasn't deterred. The dog's behavior was too deliberate to ignore.
I don't know, Reese, but something feels important. Like it's trying to tell us something.
Reese's eyes darted around, her hand instinctively reaching for her gun. The quiet was oppressive now, broken only by the distant rustling of leaves. There was no sound of the usual city life. No chatter, no cars, no people. The dog was still ahead of them, its tail flicking anxiously. It barked again, louder this time, and turned into another alley, disappearing from sight. Finn quickened his pace.
Stay close.
They rounded the corner into another deserted street, the dim glow of street lamps casting long shadows. It was getting harder to ignore the growing sense of dread. The city, once familiar and full of life, now felt like a ghost town, and every step they took seemed to lead them further away from the world they knew. The street lamps flickered intermittently, casting brief moments of light before plunging them into darkness once more. It felt like time itself was warping, like they were walking through a place untouched by normalcy. Reese was starting to lose her patience.
I don't care what the dog's doing, Finn. I'm about to call this in.
But Finn kept moving forward.
Just a little further. Trust me.
The dog led them to a dead-end street where an old, rusted warehouse loomed. Its metal door was covered in grime and rust, the hinges barely hanging on. The windows were cracked, their glass shattered on the ground below. The place looked abandoned, forgotten by time. The old warehouse loomed before them, its metal exterior dulled by time and neglect. Finn stood at the front, squinting at the rusty padlock that dangled from a chain on the warehouse door. There was something off about it, scrapes on the metal and the chain, as if it had been recently disturbed. His gut twisted, an unshakable feeling settling in the pit of his stomach.
I don't like this.
Reese muttered, her fingers brushing the handle of her gun as if seeking reassurance.
This place gives me the creeps.
Finn didn't reply immediately. Instead, he crouched to get a closer look at the padlock. Noticing the fresh scrape marks,
Someone's been here recently.
his voice was low as though he didn't want to believe it. Reese raised an eyebrow.
You think it's related to the dog?
Finn nodded, glancing at the scruffy dog by the door, its unblinking stare unnerving, as if urging them forward. Reese sighed.
All right, let's get this over with.
She unlocked the padlock and the door creaked open, releasing a foul odor of decay. Both officers paused, holding their breath.
Jesus, what died in here?
Reese gagged, covering her nose. The dog darted inside without hesitation. The officers exchanged uneasy glances and followed, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The warehouse was still, filled with broken furniture and debris. A broken light bulb swayed from the ceiling, casting eerie shadows. The cold temperature sent a shiver down their spines.
Stay alert.
Finn whispered, his voice strained as the stench grew stronger.
Something's not right.
Reese nodded, though her eyes were scanning the shadows, every creak of the wooden floor beneath their feet amplifying the growing sense of dread. The dog was moving ahead, its movements precise, almost purposeful, as it led them deeper into the warehouse. Suddenly, a noise echoed from the back, a soft scraping sound, followed by the faintest shuffle, as if something was moving. Reese stiffened, her hand instinctively going to her gun.
Did you hear that?
She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Finn motioned for her to stay quiet, his senses on high alert. They both crept forward, their footsteps muffled by the thick dust and broken boxes underfoot. The dog was still ahead, its tail twitching, its eyes fixed on something in the distance. Reese's unease deepened.
This is a bad idea. We should have called it in.
Too late now.
Finn muttered, his gaze never leaving the dog. The deeper they went into the warehouse, the more unsettling it became. Broken boxes lay scattered, their contents abandoned in haste. Dark marks marred the floor, as though something had been dragged recently. The stench of decay was overpowering, making Reese's stomach turn.
Who would leave this mess behind?
Reese whispered, scanning the room. Finn motioned toward a corner. Half buried under discarded items was a box. He opened it carefully, revealing children's clothes, tattered and hastily thrown together, as if abandoned in a rush.
This isn't right.
Reese muttered, her face pale.
Who leaves children's clothes like this?
Finn didn't answer, his mind racing. The dog suddenly darted toward a metal door at the far end. It stopped, looked back at them, eyes gleaming with unsettling intensity.
That's our next stop.
Finn said grimly. Reese hesitated but followed. The air grew heavier, shadows flickering unnervingly. As they neared the door, a muffled thud echoed from the other side, making Reese's heart race.
Finn,
She said, voice tight with fear.
we should go, now.
Finn's hand gripped the door handle, his face set in determination.
No turning back now.
He pushed the door open, revealing a darkened room beyond. The light from their flashlights revealed a grim sight. A man's body, dressed in decent clothes, lying lifeless on the floor. His face was pale, his eyes wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. Reese's breath caught in her throat.
Oh my God.
She whispered.
Is he dead?
Finn knelt beside the body, inspecting it closely. The man appeared to have been dead for days, maybe weeks. But what struck Finn most was a small cross pendant that hung around the man's neck, its edges worn from age. It was a detail that made the situation feel even more ominous. The dog sat motionless beside the body, its eyes never leaving them, as if guarding the scene.
We need to report this.
Reese said, her voice shaky. Finn nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on the pendant. Something wasn't adding up. This was no ordinary discovery. The mystery deepened, and the weight of the situation was pressing in on them. Just as they were about to step back, they heard the sound of heavy footsteps approaching from outside the warehouse.
Shit.
Finn hissed.
We've got company. Move.
Finn and Reese crouched behind a stack of rotting boxes, straining to hear the faint sound of footsteps. The air was thick with tension and the stench of decay. The dog remained still beside the body, its unblinking gaze fixed on the officers, as though it understood the gravity of the moment.
Finn,
Reese whispered.
why is the dog still here?
Finn stayed focused on the door, every muscle tense.
I don't know, but We haven't seen the last of it, or whatever's in here.
The sound of footsteps grew louder. A tall man, dressed in dark, weathered clothing, stepped into the warehouse holding a bulky object. His gaze swept over the room, briefly landing on the body before narrowing in confusion. Reese's grip tightened on her gun.
Finn, we should go.
Finn didn't move. His eyes were still fixed on the man, analyzing every movement.
Wait,
He said softly.
let's see what he does first.
The man stood still for a moment, his brow furrowed as he surveyed the scene. His eyes flicked to the dog, which was still sitting motionless next to the body. Something about the dog's unflinching presence seemed to throw the man off.
What the hell?
The man muttered under his breath, his voice low and edged with suspicion. Before either officer could react, the dog let out a loud, frantic bark, the sound echoing through the stillness of the warehouse. It was sharp, urgent, a warning. The man's head snapped in their direction, his expression one of realization.
Shit.
Reese hissed.
He knows we're here.
The man's gaze darted to the shadows where Finn and Reese were hiding. His hand quickly reached for something hidden beneath his jacket, an unmistakable gleam of metal. A weapon.
Move.
Finn barked, grabbing Reese's arm and pulling her toward the exit. The two officers bolted, their hearts racing as the sound of the man's footsteps grew louder, a heavy thudding that echoed through the cavernous space. They didn't dare look back, their only focus on the door ahead. The dog's loud bark rang out again, as if it were rallying them, urging them forward. Finn's mind raced as they sprinted across the floor, the noise of their footsteps mixing with the man's pursuit behind them. The warehouse was a maze of crates, shadows, and narrow passages, and Finn knew that they had to make it out of there. Fast. The door to the courtyard was within reach, but the man's footsteps grew louder, relentless. Just as Finn and Reese reached the door, it swung open, and the man's silhouette filled the doorway. Gun raised. Finn shoved Reese through first, then slammed the door shut behind them. The sound echoed, but there was no time to pause.
We need to lose him.
Finn muttered, scanning for cover. They ducked behind discarded crates, their bodies pressed to the cold ground. The courtyard was dark, the faint hum of city life distant. The man's heavy footsteps rang out as he searched methodically. Finn signaled for Reese to stay quiet, his grip tight on her arm. The man's breathing grew louder, and Finn held his breath, waiting for the right moment to move. Suddenly, the dog barked loudly, breaking the silence. The man froze, turning toward the sound.
This is it.
Finn whispered, pulling Reese to her feet. They swiftly moved from their hiding spot to the next set of crates. The dog, perched nearby, barked again, distracting the man. As he turned toward the noise, Finn and Reese made their way through the maze of crates, the man's footsteps growing fainter as he pursued the dog. At the far end of the courtyard, Reese grabbed Finn's arm.
We've got to get back to the station.
She panted.
We should report this and get back up.
Finn nodded, his mind racing.
Wait, we have to investigate more. There's something more behind those box of clothes and that man.
The man's footsteps faded, and with them, the immediate danger seemed to dissipate. The courtyard was silent once again, save for the occasional rustle of the wind. Finn and Reese leaned against the cold brick wall, trying to catch their breath.
Do you think he's gone?
Reese asked, her voice shaky but filled with hope.
I don't know now,
Finn said, his gaze darting back toward the warehouse.
but we can't afford to waste any more time.
Reese nodded, but there was something in her eyes, something that spoke of her unease.
You're right. Let's keep on searching first. What if we're walking away from the biggest lead we've ever had?
Finn paused, his eyes searching the dark, his mind racing. He knew what she was saying. They couldn't walk away from this, not when they were so close. The dog had led them here for a reason, and the truth was still waiting in the shadows.
We'll get back up.
He said finally.
But we're not leaving. Not yet.
Reese's eyes met his and she nodded, though her hesitation lingered.
All right, but we do this carefully. No more surprises.
Finn smiled grimly.
No promises.
The dog, silent for the moment, sat perched on top of a nearby crate, its eyes gleaming in the darkness. As they prepared to return to the warehouse, Finn couldn't shake the feeling that the dog was still watching them, its role in this dangerous game far from over. It had led them here for a reason, and it was clear now that whatever lay ahead would only get more dangerous from here on out. Finn and Reese crouched low against the side of the warehouse. their bodies pressed against the cold, damp concrete. The night was eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of the city, far away in the darkness. They had no time to waste. The man was likely regrouping, and the longer they lingered, the more danger they'd find themselves in. But the mystery of what was happening inside the warehouse had become more pressing than any personal safety concerns.
There's got to be another way in.
Finn whispered, scanning the perimeter of the building. His eyes narrowed as he spotted a small, broken window on the opposite side, barely noticeable unless one was looking for it. Reese followed his gaze and nodded.
It's our best bet. Let's get in and get out, fast.
They moved swiftly across the yard, their feet light on the cracked asphalt. When they reached the window, Finn led the way, checking for any signs of movement. With practiced precision, he hoisted himself up and through the broken frame, disappearing into the dark storage room beyond. Reese followed him, sliding her body through the narrow gap. The air inside was thick with dust and mildew, and the room reeked of mold and forgotten things. The dampness pressed against them, almost suffocating in its weight. But their focus remained clear. No distractions, no hesitation. They needed answers. Now. Finn clicked on his flashlight, the beam of light cutting through the dense shadows, revealing shelves cluttered with old crates and tarps. Broken furniture was scattered around, some of it overturned, as though someone had been in a rush to leave. The faint outline of rusted equipment loomed in the corners.
We'll have to make this quick.
Finn muttered, his voice barely audible in the heavy air. Reese nodded in agreement, her eyes darting around the room, searching for anything that might provide them with the clues they needed. They began to search systematically, moving through the room with urgency. The longer they lingered, the greater the risk of the man returning. Finn's heart pounded in his chest as his eyes scanned the area for anything out of place, anything that could give them an edge. Reese's flashlight landed on something unusual near the far wall. A small iron cabinet sat partially hidden behind an old tarp. It was locked, but with a quick glance at Finn, Reese went to work, pulling out a small set of tools from her belt. She was quick and efficient, picking the lock within moments. Inside, there was a stack of manila folders, their edges worn and faded. She flipped the top one open, and her breath caught in her throat as she scanned the contents.
Finn, you need to see this.
She said quietly, her voice trembling with the weight of what she'd found. Finn moved over quickly, his flashlight illuminating the pages she was holding. The photographs were grainy but unmistakable. Images of children, their faces pale and haunting, eyes staring back at them with a mix of fear and confusion. Dates were scrawled next to their names. Missing. Months. No one knew where they'd gone. The names in the folders were familiar to them, as they matched the descriptions of children from local missing persons reports. The realization hit them both like a slap in the face. These weren't random disappearances. There was something much darker going on here. Something organized, something planned. Reese flipped through a few more folders, her hands shaking as the weight of the discovery settled on her.
This is insane.
She whispered.
They've been missing for months, and no one knows what happened to them. It's like they just vanished.
Finn's jaw tightened.
This goes far beyond a few missing kids. Whoever is behind this, they've been hiding in plain sight. This is organized.
They paused, the air thick with the revelation. What they were holding in their hands was more than just evidence. It was a breadcrumb trail leading them straight into the heart of something far more sinister than they had ever imagined. Just as the gravity of the situation sank in, the dog reappeared. It was standing in the doorway of the storage room, its glowing eyes reflecting the dim light of their flashlights. It hadn't made a sound, but its presence was unmistakable. Reese and Finn turned toward the dog, their hearts racing, both relieved and unnerved by its sudden reappearance. The dog's gaze locked onto them, its eyes intense, as if it understood the danger they were facing. It barked once, but this time, the sound was softer, less urgent. It was almost as though it were offering comfort, guiding them out of the building before they got caught. Finn met Reese's eyes. She didn't need to speak. She knew what he was thinking. The dog had led them here for a reason, and it seemed to want them to leave before the situation escalated further. But before they could make a move, A loud scraping sound broke through the stillness. It was the unmistakable noise of metal on metal. Someone was coming,
We have to go now.
Finn said, his voice sharp with urgency. Reese nodded, grabbing the folders and shoving them into her bag. The dog's presence seemed to steady her for a moment, but the looming threat of being discovered was never far from her mind. They moved quickly, inching toward the back door, but as they neared it, the scraping sound grew louder, and the unmistakable click of a door opening reached their ears. The man. He was back.
Shit.
Finn muttered, already moving toward the shadowy corner of the room.
We're trapped.
The dog's bark rang out again, louder this time. The man froze, his footsteps halting, as he looked in the direction of the sound.
What the hell?
He muttered. It was their chance. Finn grabbed Reese's arm and they bolted for the door, their feet pounding the floor as they raced toward the alleyway outside. But as they reached the door, a loud bang echoed through the room, the sound of a gunshot. They didn't look back. The only thing that mattered was getting out alive. The alleyway stretched ahead of them, a dark, narrow passage that seemed to go on forever. The night air bit at their skin as they ran, but the cold was nothing compared to the heat of their fear. Gunshots rang out again, followed by the sound of the man's footsteps getting closer. They needed to make it to cover before he caught up with them. Finn and Reese darted down the alley, their hearts racing as the danger closed in around them. The sound of the man's pursuit was relentless. The adrenaline surged through their veins, propelling them forward. But there was a nagging voice in the back of Finn's mind, a realization that they couldn't keep running forever.
Reese, we can't go back to the warehouse without backup.
Finn said between gasps.
This is bigger than we thought. We need to escalate this.
I know,
Reese replied, her voice grim.
but we can't just let this go either. We've seen enough to know there's something really bad happening here.
Finn nodded.
We can't stop now. We have to get to the bottom of this, no matter the cost.
As they turned a corner, they found a quiet side street where they could momentarily catch their breath. The man's footsteps faded into the distance, though they knew it wasn't over. They were far from safe, but for the moment, they had managed to escape. Reese pulled out the photograph of Isabella, the girl who had been missing for 3 months. Her face stared back at them from the photo, young and innocent, her eyes wide with uncertainty.
This is just the beginning.
Reese said softly, the weight of the discovery heavy in her words.
This is a network. There's something much bigger going on here.
Finn took the photograph from her and stared at it for a long moment.
This isn't just a case anymore. This is a mission. We can't let these kids vanish without a trace.
Reese's eyes hardened.
We won't. Not if I have anything to say about it.
The responsibility was overwhelming, but they both knew there was no turning back. They had uncovered a system of corruption and neglect, and now it was their job to bring it to light. They couldn't do it alone, but they would continue to fight. Together, they would dig deeper into the shadows, no matter how dangerous it became, because they now understood that the truth was out there, and it was waiting for them to uncover it. Finn and Reese moved through the darkened streets with swift, purposeful steps. The weight of their decision pressed down on them with every block they crossed. They had just uncovered something too dangerous, too widespread, to keep to themselves. The missing children, the files, the network, everything pointed to a web of corruption they couldn't untangle alone. The only way forward was to expose it, to let the public know what was happening behind the city's quiet facade.
We can't do this alone.
Reese muttered, her eyes scanning the street as they walked.
We need to get this out there.
Finn nodded grimly.
The newspaper's our best shot, but we'll have to be careful. If we're wrong, we could put ourselves in even more danger.
Reese clenched her jaw. She knew the risks, but the thought of more children vanishing without a trace was unbearable. The feeling of responsibility was heavy, suffocating almost, but there was no other choice. They had to act. If they didn't, who would? As they walked, the city felt different. The quiet streets that usually felt safe now seemed ominous, as though something, or someone, was watching them from the shadows. Their nerves were on edge, each footstep echoing in the night air, reminding them of how exposed they were. But they couldn't turn back now, not with the evidence they had, not with the weight of the missing children's faces fresh in their minds.
I keep thinking, if we don't do this, who will?
Reese said, her voice laced with both fear and determination. Finn didn't respond immediately. Instead, he kept his eyes focused on the path ahead, the low glow of streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. He had been thinking the same thing.
We're the only ones who know the truth. If we don't make this public, it'll just keep happening.
They quickened their pace, knowing time was running out. The longer they stayed in the dark, the greater the chances that whoever was behind the disappearances would catch up with them. They arrived at the newspaper building, an old structure with large glass windows and a faintly humming neon sign. The street was empty, but inside the bustle of late-night journalists filled the air. They approached the security guard at the entrance.
Can I help you?
He asked, his tone wary. Finn flashed his badge, still gripping the folder with the missing children's files.
We need to see the editor. It's urgent.
The guard raised an eyebrow.
You don't look like press.
We're not,
Reese replied, her voice firm.
but we have an important information here.
The guard studied them for a moment before sighing and stepping aside.
I'll let you in, but you're on your own past here.
They hurried past him, moving swiftly through the lobby and up to the editor's office on the second floor. Time was of the essence, and they couldn't afford to be caught. Inside, the editor, a man in his 50s, looked up with suspicion.
Can I help you?
Without hesitation, Finn opened the folder, spilling the photos and documents across his desk.
These children are missing, and no one's looking for them. We found evidence in an abandoned warehouse. Something is going on.
The editor picked up one of the photos, studying it carefully.
There's no record of these cases.
He said, brow furrowed.
Are you sure?
Finn leaned in.
We've seen the evidence. We need you to help expose this.
The editor hesitated, the weight of the situation clear on his face.
Publishing something like this would cause waves and it could get ugly.
Reese stepped forward.
We're not asking for promises. We're asking for action. These children need someone to fight for them.
After a pause, the editor sighed and stood.
All right, I'll do what I can. But once this gets out, there's no turning back.
Finn and Reese exchanged a look, knowing they couldn't back down now. The editor began pacing, thinking.
I'll discreetly investigate, contact trusted people, and get background on the network behind the disappearances, but it won't be easy.
Finn nodded.
We understand. We're not leaving until we know this is in motion.
Reese's eyes drifted to the window. She froze. Outside, she saw the dog, its glowing eyes locked on them from the street. It felt as if the animal understood everything that had just happened. Finn followed her gaze and smiled faintly.
I think we're on the right path.
Reese nodded.
We have to be. There's no turning back now.
After the meeting, Finn and Reese left the newspaper office, the weight of their decision settling on their shoulders. They had just exposed themselves to greater danger, but they had also set the wheels in motion. The editor would investigate further, and the truth would eventually come out. But they still had a long way to go. As they stepped into the cool night air, the dog remained outside, watching them silently. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, a constant presence that felt both protective and mysterious. Reese felt a shiver run down her spine. The dog had guided them here, and it was still watching over them. There was something about the animal that felt like fate. It was more than just a stray. It was a sign, a companion in their quest for answers. Finn met her gaze, a knowing look in his eyes.
We're not alone in this.
He said softly.
That dog's part of this. Somehow it's part of our journey.
Reese nodded, her heart heavy but determined.
We can't stop now. There's more to this than we've uncovered. We have to go back to the warehouse.
Finn hesitated, the danger of returning to the scene still looming over them. But he understood. They had to push forward no matter the cost. With the dog at their heels, they began the long walk back to the warehouse, the darkness around them growing deeper with every step. The stakes were higher than ever, but they knew they couldn't turn back. The truth was waiting for them, and they had to find it before it was too late. The warehouse loomed in the distance, its silhouette sharp against the night sky. As Finn and Reese approached, a sense of foreboding washed over them. The building was completely dark. No lights, no movement. Just an eerie silence that seemed to pulse with something dark and waiting. Reese shivered, her breath visible in the cool air.
I don't like this. It's too quiet.
Finn didn't respond, his eyes scanning the shadows, alert for any sign of the man who had chased them earlier. Though they couldn't see him, the fear lingered. He could be anywhere, hidden in the dark corners of the abandoned space. They came to the rusty doors, which creaked loudly as they pushed them open, the sound echoing in the cavernous space. The air inside was cold and sharp, the kind of cold that seemed to cut right through their clothes. Finn stepped inside, his senses on high alert. The faint sound of dripping water echoed from somewhere deep within, but otherwise the warehouse was empty. Too empty,
Let's find what we came for.
Finn muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Reese nodded, a sense of urgency in her movements. They both knew they couldn't waste time. If the man came back, they needed to be ready. They moved cautiously through the warehouse, stepping carefully between the scattered boxes and broken machinery. Shadows danced on the walls, shifting with every step they took. Reese's heart raced, the silence becoming more oppressive with each passing moment. The deeper they ventured, the more the warehouse seemed to close in around them.
You think he's still here?
Reese asked, her voice tense with fear. Finn didn't respond immediately, his eyes darting from corner to corner.
I don't know, but we can't afford to wait. We need evidence, something we can use.
As they moved further into the warehouse, Reese's stomach twisted with unease. The place felt like it was alive, the air thick with hidden danger. They had come this far, but they had no idea how much further they would have to go to uncover the truth. Then, just as they reached a row of towering shelves, faint voices filtered through the silence. Reese froze, her breath catching in her throat. The voices were low, muffled, but distinct. Finn's gaze snapped to hers, his eyes wide with sudden realization.
We're not alone.
He whispered. They stood frozen for a moment, listening carefully. The voices were coming from somewhere deeper in the warehouse. Without a word, they both started moving toward the sound, each step a calculated risk. The dog, which had been trailing them since they entered the building, suddenly darted off in the direction of a side door. It moved with purpose, its eyes glowing in the dim light as it disappeared through the crack in the door. Reese hesitated for a moment, her instincts screaming at her to be cautious. But Finn, without hesitation, followed the dog.
We need to know what's going on in there.
They reached the door just as the dog's tail disappeared into the darkness of the room beyond. Finn pushed the door open, and they slipped inside, their hearts pounding in their chests. The room was small, dimly lit by a single hanging light. At a table in the center, 3 men sat, speaking in hushed tones. On the table before them were various documents and photographs. Reese's breath caught as her eyes locked onto one of the photos. Isabella, the missing girl they had been investigating. The realization hit them like a slap to the face. These men were involved. They were the ones behind the disappearances. Finn's hand tightened around the doorframe, his mind racing. One of the men, the same one who had chased them earlier, was speaking, his voice low and agitated.
We need to clean up this mess. The more attention this gets, the harder it'll be to cover our tracks.
The other 2 men nodded, their expressions grim. One of them shuffled through the papers, muttering to himself.
We've got to move fast. If anyone catches wind of this, it's over.
Reese's stomach churned, the weight of what they were hearing sinking in. These men weren't just small-time criminals. They were part of something much larger, a conspiracy that stretched far beyond what they had imagined. The dog, who had been watching from the doorway, stepped into the room. Its presence was calm and steady, a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere in the room. The men turned at the sound of its soft padding on the floor, their eyes narrowing as they studied the animal. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Finn's mind raced. He couldn't stay here any longer.
Reese,
He whispered, his voice tight with urgency.
we need to leave, now.
She nodded, her face pale but determined. Without making a sound, they slowly backed toward the door, careful not to alert the men to their presence. The dog remained in the room, its unblinking eyes fixed on the men, as if daring them to make a move. Once outside, the cool night air felt like a balm, though it did nothing to ease the tension in their bodies. Their footsteps were hurried, but they knew they couldn't run forever. The dog stayed with them, following closely behind, its presence oddly comforting in the growing darkness. Reese was the first to speak, her voice shaky but urgent.
We need to call the police. This has gone too far.
Finn pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed the number. The dog walked alongside them, its eyes glowing softly in the dark. It had been with them every step of the way, guiding them, protecting them. As Finn spoke to the dispatcher, giving details of the warehouse and the men inside, Reese kept a nervous watch over their surroundings. The dog stopped briefly and looked back toward the warehouse, its gaze unyielding.
It's still watching us?
Reese murmured, her voice filled with awe. Finn finished the call, tucking his phone back into his pocket.
They're on their way. The warehouse will be surrounded soon. We did the right thing.
But Reese couldn't shake the feeling that they had only scratched the surface of something far darker. She glanced down at the dog.
We never would have gotten this far without it.
The dog's eyes seemed to glimmer in the darkness, almost as if it understood. The sound of sirens soon broke the silence of the night, and within moments, police cars flooded the area. Officers rushed into the warehouse, their movements swift and decisive. Finn and Reese watched from a safe distance, knowing they had done everything they could. The next few hours were a blur of activity as the police secured the evidence they had uncovered. The men who had been part of the disappearance ring were arrested, and the files on the missing children were carefully cataloged. The families of the children were notified, and hope was rekindled for those who had lost loved ones. As the police finished their work, Reese and Finn stood together, watching the scene unfold. Reese knelt to pet the dog one last time, her hand lingering on his scruffy fur.
Thank you, friend.
She whispered, her voice soft with emotion. The dog met her gaze briefly before trotting into the shadows, disappearing as quietly as he had come. News of the dismantling of the disappearance ring spread quickly, with Finn and Reese hailed as heroes. But to them, the real hero was the stray dog. Without him, they might never have found the path to the truth. She never knew where he came from or where he went, but his actions left an indelible mark. Weeks later, Finn and Reese visited an animal shelter. Among the dogs, one caught her eye, a wiry-haired mutt with familiar, intelligent eyes.
I think we found our friend.
She said, smiling as she petted him. The stray's memory lingered, a silent hero who had guided them when they needed it most.